Hi, my name is Bill Braniff, and in this lecture I'll be providing an introduction to the topic of radicalization. Radicalization is, of course, a bit of a buzzword. The truth is that every militant organization in history has had to convince individual recruits that violence was necessary to achieve the stated aims of the organization. And so, really, when we talk about radicalization, we are also talking about recruitment and the production of propaganda in order to inspire a radicalized response. And it's important that we keep that in the back of our mind so that we don't lose sight of the organization that is cognizantly trying to achieve this end state by focusing only on the receiver of that information. But it is important to look at the individual receivers as well. Another nuance that's worth appreciating as we start this topic, as we start this discussion, is the difference between the acceptance of an extreme belief with the acceptance of the idea that violence is necessary to advance that belief. Another nuance worth appreciating is the difference between an extreme belief, an idea that's not held by the majority of mainstream society, from the idea of the belief that violence is necessary to advance a belief. Right? The first one we might call radicalism or radical beliefs. It's really important that we separate that from both radical behavior, advancing those beliefs through violence. It's also important to remember that some terrorist or extremist organizations use violence to advance beliefs that are held by a majority of mainstream society, or at least a large portion of mainstream society. So again, we have to focus on behaviors when we're talking about terrorism and extremist violence, and not conflate radical beliefs and violence to advance beliefs, whether they're radical or mainstream. Radical beliefs, of course, are not criminal, but engaging in material support for extremist organizations or designated terrorist organizations is a crime. For the purposes of this introduction to radicalization, I'm specifically referring to the acceptance of violence as necessary to advance an ideological goal. I would encourage you, however, as consumers of books and articles, news media, to determine what the specific author means when he or she says or uses the term radicalization, because it does have different meanings in different contexts. So what are some of the basic components of radicalization that we're going to discuss? For this approach, I'm indebted to Dr. Peter Neumann, the director of the International Center for the Study of Radicalization at King's College London. Dr. Neumann is a star researcher, and he's described these key ingredients as follows: grievance, ideology, and mobilization. And his argument is that if you look at many radicalization models, you'll find these three ingredients in most, if not all of them. Now, I've adapted his very succinct model and included a fourth ingredient, cognitive opening, which I'll explain in a bit more detail in a second. These four ingredients interact with one another. Radicalization is not a linear process. One doesn't start at the beginning, move through all four phases, and then emerge as a terrorist on the other end. Instead, it's some combination of some or all of the ingredients. And these facets are at play, but just because someone is toying with any one or two of these facets, whether it's an ideology or whether one believes in the legitimacy of a set of grievances, it doesn't mean that someone's going to progress down the path of radicalization. And so what we're saying here is that this isn't a deterministic process. So in sum, not all four ingredients are required. We're not talking about a linear process necessarily, and the process isn't deterministic. So let's look at each of the four ingredients. Grievance, of course, is the idea that there's something wrong with the world. There's some inequality. There's some sort of wrong that needs to be righted, an issue that can be addressed. Cognitive opening is the idea that an individual is able to be influenced by an outside force, whether that's a really compelling idea or a really charismatic individual. Ideology is given a lot of attention in terrorism studies. An ideology is a set of beliefs that describes the world. It oftentimes describes what's wrong with the world as well as what the world is supposed to look like. But most importantly, it provides a blueprint for action so that you can make the world right. So ideologies are not just a set of descriptive ideas, but they're also a set of ideas that foster action. We'll talk about ideology, in fact, to a greater degree in the next lecture. mobilization is, of course, the idea that in order to achieve some sort of change, you can't just think about these ideas, that you have to take action. And so mobilization could be garnering resources, money, materiel. It could be meeting with other individuals and plotting or planning to conduct some kind of action. But the idea here is that you're moving towards a real-world outcome. I think the common wisdom about how one radicalizes is that it starts with a grievance. An individual is either personally aggrieved or they're upset about the state of their community. They feel their community is persecuted. That makes them cognitively open. They're looking for answers. And a militant ideology comes along and provides all of those answers. It tells them why they and their community are persecuted, who's responsible for the persecution, and what that person needs to do to address the persecution. And so that person then socializes these ideas with others. That could be online, that could be in person, and they mobilize towards violence. If we look at real-world case studies, we find that this isn't always the case. And a great example comes to us from the Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. The younger brother, Jakar Tsarnaev, arrived at his end state through a slightly different chain of events. His parents separated a few years prior to the marathon bombings. He had been very sort of successful and successfully assimilated and integrated in high school, a very well-adjusted kid, went to college, and his experience in college was less gratifying and over time sort of deteriorated. And so he went home and started spending a lot more time with his older brother, Tamerlan. It appears that the separation of his parents, his deteriorating situation in college, and then his admiration for his older brother is really what creates the cognitive opening that allows him to progress or to start his journey down this road of radicalization. Grievance and ideology, these are things that are introduced after the fact, or along the way, but after this trajectory has already started. Different academic disciplines, of course, are going to focus on different ingredients. Political scientists and sociologists might focus on the interplay between grievances and ideology. They might apply social movement theory to understand mobilization at a broader level. Psychologists, of course, are going to be most concerned with cognitive opening, as are some of the psychologists that I'll speak to you in this module. Now, I find this 4-ingredient model quite helpful because it helps us understand not only radicalization, but some of the responses to radicalization as well. And I think it does so in a fairly comprehensive way, perhaps because it's general. If we're trying to be comprehensive about countering violent extremism, it's logical that we would have to address grievances, fill cognitive openings with positive ideas or positive alternatives, counter militant ideologies and the individuals that espouse them, and then ultimately, on the counterterrorism end of the spectrum, interdict efforts at mobilization when they do occur. It's really important that all 4 of these countering violent extremism initiatives are taken in parallel with one another. Again, because not all individuals who radicalize will hit each of the 4 steps along the way, again, because this isn't linear and not all 4 elements are necessary. So if one was only focusing on countering militant ideologies, right, one would have missed Jakar Tsarnaev, whose radicalization journey doesn't begin with a militant ideology, it begins with admiration for his older brother. By contrast, if all 4 of these activities are done in parallel with one another, you have the opportunity to stem the tide of radicalization at a broader, more societal level. There's a few other terms we should just highlight quickly that are often discussed in the context of radicalization. The first is de-radicalization, and this is the idea of convincing someone to abandon militant beliefs that they've previously subscribed to. So actually changing their minds, changing their beliefs. Another term that is frequently used is counter-radicalization. This is actually more akin to the ideas that we've just discussed. It's the idea of frustrating the radicalization process from ever happening in the first place. So these are the initiatives like countering ideologies, addressing grievances. Another term is disengagement. Disengagement is a topic studied by a START researcher at University of Massachusetts Lowell, John Horgan, who runs a center there. They look at people who have disengaged from violent behavior, even if they haven't necessarily given up their radical beliefs. The idea here is that many people never really fully abandon the beliefs or the worldview that they have acquired, but they do, for other reasons, decide that violence is not the best course of action for them or to advance their stated goals. So in conclusion, I've just provided a quick introduction to ingredients of radicalization. We've talked about how those 4 key ingredients to radicalization suggest a strategy to counter radicalization or counter violent extremism. And I hope you'll take the opportunity to do the readings associated with this module so you can explore these topics in more depth. In our next lecture, we'll be talking more about ideology, one of the 4 ingredients that we've covered today.